But we should never have empowered a bunch of unelected bureaucrats to pick winners and losers and do it through a mechanism that I think violates the 7th Amendment and the 8th Amendment against excessive fines. So we have allowed these agencies to go to a man like my client and say, and when you get the letter, what the letter says is, if you do not cooperate with us, you have violated the Clean Water Act. If you do not cooperate with us, you will be subject to the penalties of $64,000 a day. Well, think about it. In 10 days, you're out $750,000. Whether you're right, wrong, or whether you did anything wrong or not, I just happen to have a wealthy client who was willing to fight back, and we ended up winning it. But in most circumstances, the moment you get that letter, you're done. You are done, and the agencies know that. And that's why Congress needs to retake our legislative authority, but we also need to remember who we work for.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. The Founding Fathers set the government up to have 3 branches of government: the legislative branch, judicial branch, and the executive branch. But under President Roosevelt's New Deal, a 4th branch of government was established called the administrative state. Over the decades, this 4th branch of government has grown out of control to the point that fishermen were told they had to pay out of their own pockets to have monitors on their boats. These fishermen filed a lawsuit that was taken all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled in favor of the fishermen. Because of this case, courts have more authority to overturn the administrative state when it doesn't follow the law and how it is written. This is a good first step in reining in the administrative state, but this is just the beginning. The Republican Study Committee has created the new Article 1 task force that will focus on stopping the overreach of the administrative state and reasserting Congress's constitutional role. The chair of this new task force is our guest today. She grew up on a ranch where she learned the value of hard work and perseverance, earning a scholarship to attend college. She went on to earn her law degree, then had a successful 34-year career as a litigator, during which she became a leading advocate on issues such as water rights, natural resources, and defending the interests of hardworking Americans. She ran for Congress and won in the 2022 elections, and she is the only congressional representative for her state of Wyoming. And I want to welcome Congresswoman Harriet Hageman to the podcast.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here.
Thanks so much. So we always start with something that was kind of fun about our guests, so people kind of get to know you a little bit more. So my understanding is that you attended Casper College on a livestock judging scholarship. Is that correct?
I did.
So what does that entail?
So one of the reasons that I'm such a strong advocate of Title IX was I was one of the first beneficiaries, I guess you'd say, of that law. I went into junior high in 1975, just a couple of years after Title IX was passed by Congress. And what Title IX says is you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. And so when I was in junior high and high school as well, I took some of your more non-traditional classes, especially at that time. I took shop classes. I learned how to weld. I learned how to build pig barns. I worked on wood lathes. I built, a lot of wooden type of structures and bowls and things like that. But I also joined the ag classes, and I was a member of the Future Farmers of America. And I got a scholarship to Casper College to judge livestock. And while it may sound kind of strange, it's actually one of the things that's probably been as foundational as anything else in terms of the skill set that I developed because of what livestock judging is. And I was one of the very first women livestock judges at the college level in 1981, which is when I went to college. So I went to Casper College for 2 years, and then I went to the University of Wyoming, where I received both my bachelor's and my law degree. But livestock judging helps you to think on your feet. It forces you to be very discerning in terms of how you look at things and comparing and contrasting various attributes of an animal. But the other thing it does is it requires you to defend the decisions that you've made. So you may only have 15 minutes to look at a class of, say, 4 steers, and then 6 hours later, you're going to have to go in front of a panel of judges and in 2 minutes explain why you placed them the way that you did. And you have to describe their brisket. You have to describe their hooks and pins. You have to describe the various attributes of what you're looking for in a steer, which is for meat production. And you have all different kinds of terminology that you use. But it was a great way to start my college career judging livestock and traveling around the United States to do it.
That's kind of fascinating. As someone who has not lived in a ranching state, I mean, I'm originally from New Jersey and I live outside of Chicago, so I'm about as far as you get from a rancher. Is at heart, I would love to be a rancher, but I'm not. I think that's fascinating. I would have never thought that those qualities are involved, but then when you articulate them, it totally makes sense how those would be great qualities to learn for a career in law, a career in politics, or a career in a whole bunch of things.
It's funny. There are quite a few people who I judge livestock with that all became attorneys. There's quite a few of us from my classes when I was at Casper College. And then another gentleman that I went to college with at Casper College, he now runs the PRCA. I went to school with him in Casper, and he also got a law degree, and he runs the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association. So he's responsible for putting on like the NFR. But again, those skill sets kind of follow you through life because of what they teach you and what really sticks with you as you navigate the business and professional fields.
Well, kind of turning to our topic today, I guess you're trying to wrangle the administrative state of sorts.
Yes, and this really stems from the experience that I've had as a trial attorney. You mentioned that I practiced law for 34 years as a trial attorney, and I primarily worked for business owners, small business owners, farmers, ranchers, gravel pit companies, construction companies. I very much was on the side of the workers, the job creators, the people who really make the world go round, and the people who actually generate the funds to run our government. But just to give you an example of the kinds of cases that I handled, is I once represented a landowner in northern Wyoming, and he moved an irrigation ditch on his property, affected about 2.1 acres of land. Well, the EPA decided to go after him, and it was a test case. And the point of it was to try to force that they would be able to take control over irrigation infrastructure under the auspices of the Clean Water Act. So they came in and they said that irrigation ditch was a navigable water of the United States, which is the standard. The federal government and the EPA has no jurisdiction over anything that is not a navigable water of the United States. So they declared his irrigation ditch a navigable water of the United States and said that he had to have a 404 permit in order to clean out that ditch. Well, you can imagine what that would do to irrigation throughout the entire interior West. But in addition to that, he was subjected to fines of $37,500 a day.
Oh, my gosh.
So he did the work in 2005. They brought an enforcement action against him in 2008. He immediately hired me. We went to trial on that case in 2014. Well, all you have to do is do the math. By the time we went to trial in that case, he was facing penalties of almost $65 million for moving an irrigation ditch on his own personal property. And this was a case that I just knew we absolutely could not afford to lose because it would have destroyed our farmers and our ranchers in Wyoming and Nebraska and Colorado and Montana and South Dakota and anywhere where we irrigate. So it was an extremely important case, but it also demonstrated the tyranny that is inherent in our federal government. That's just one of the cases that I handled against the feds, but I think it really illustrates how all-powerful these administrative agencies have become. Because if you go read the Clean Water Act, it was never intended by Congress, the legislative body, the governing body. It was never intended by Congress to cover irrigation ditches. That's why they use the terminology that they did. But these administrative agencies, what they do is they reinterpret the law. And that's why when you were in your introduction, you were talking about the fishing boat case. That's the circumstance. What these administrative agencies have been allowed to do is they take a law that says you must paint all walls blue. And then they come in and say, well, but under our interpretation, that could also mean chartreuse, which kind of looks like blue in certain lighting. And it could be red if it had a contrast with a purple, because then that's kind of like a blue if you were to mix those colors. And I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but that's what they've done. And the courts, through this Chevron deference doctrine, has allowed them to do that, has allowed them to interpret the law, to apply it and enforce it any way that they want to. And that's why the Loper Bright decision, where they came in and the Supreme Court said, not anymore. That we are not going to defer to these administrative agencies as they try to reinterpret the law. It's our job to interpret the law. So that was a huge, huge, huge win. So, for example, when I went to trial on that case, the judge had to assume that my irrigation ditch was in fact a navigable water of the United States because the agency said it was.
Wow.
In other words, I lost the argument before I ever went to trial. I had to win it on another way, and I did win. After a 2-week trial, we won because the jury came back in our favor. But the judges used to have to defer to the interpretations of the agencies. So getting back to the Article 1 task force, it is to make sure that we take what the Supreme Court has done and force the legislative body to be the body that is writing unambiguous, clear, crisp laws so that everybody knows what the rules are. And so my role as the chairman of the Article 1 task force is to help my fellow congressmen and women become better legislative practitioners so we don't leave it up to the courts and we don't leave it up to the agencies.
You know, I really hope that years from now, we'll look back at this time, and I'm sure that you recognize it because you're really right in the middle and you're helping lead this kind of right sizing of government and the administrative state. But I think it's such a big deal, and it could be so consequential for our country because the administrative state, as your example shows in an incredible way, has gotten so out of control. And it affects so many people's lives in ways that we've almost become used to, unfortunately. So I think that the Loper Bright case and the ruling, it has such an opportunity to reset the role of government and really make, the legislature do their job too.
It will do that. And when you say reset the role of government, that is in part where the legislature comes in, where Congress comes in. But what I always come back to is our form of government is a government of, by, and for the people. And it is my opinion that you cannot give an administrative agency the power to impose fines. Now the EPA can impose fines of $64,000 a day. It's gone up over time, which is something else I'm trying to fix. But we should never have empowered a bunch of unelected bureaucrats to pick winners and losers and do it through a mechanism that I think violates the 7th Amendment and the 8th Amendment against excessive fines. So we have allowed these agencies to go to a man like my client and say, and when you get the letter, what the letter says is, if you do not cooperate with us, you have violated the Clean Water Act. If you do not cooperate with us, you will be subject to the penalties of $64,000 a day. Well, think about it. In 10 days, you're out $750,000. Whether you're right, wrong, or whether you did anything wrong or not, I just happen to have a wealthy client who was willing to fight back. And we ended up winning it. But in most circumstances, the moment you get that letter, you're done. You are done. And the agencies know that. And that's why Congress needs to retake our legislative authority. But we also need to remember who we work for. And you cannot empower anyone who is not accountable to the people to impose penalties of $64,000 a day.
Yeah, having those right checks and balances are pretty important. So what are some legislative reforms that you're looking at to help in this situation?
So one of the things is, and the number's too high, but this is the way that it's always been, we have what's called the Reins Act. And the Reins Act is one aspect of that. And there's a lot of different parts of it. But one of the most important aspects of it is that for any regulation that has an economic impact of over $100 million, it cannot go into effect unless and until it is approved by Congress. That would dramatically slow down the rulemaking authority of these administrative agencies. And I'll just give you, again, another example, personal one that I worked on myself and a bill that I have introduced. The USDA is attempting to force our cattle and bison producers to use electronic identification ear tags. And they say it's for traceability purposes, that if there's a disease outbreak, they'd be able to quickly trace these animals and we could quarantine them and take care of the cattle and beef industry. And that all sounds fine and dandy, but that's not how it's actually going to be implemented. Ireland implemented an EID rule, an electronic identification rule. And within a year and a half, they issued an order that they had to slaughter 41,000 head of cattle, not because of a disease outbreak, but because of global warming. And what this does is it allows them to identify where the cattle are located. And if you don't use an EID, if you don't have that electronic ear tag, you can't take your cattle to market. So what they've done is they cut people off. Whoever will not comply with their rules, they cut them off from the interstate market of being able to sell their livestock. So it destroys your ranching industry. But the other thing that they can do is they can start imposing other regulations. I went to the website for Ireland just to look at the paperwork you have to fill out for an EID. And it's 65-page documents. I mean, we're talking ranchers, and they have to fill out 65-page documents related to their cattle out in the pasture. This isn't a traceability rule because when you're in a ranch in Wyoming and it's 30,000 acres, your cattle might be in 10 different pastures. And if somebody gets out into the neighbors, we don't know what other animal they've come into contact with. In other words, the entire system collapses with any kind of scrutiny at all. But according to the USDA, it could cost as much as $1.2 to $1.9 billion against our cattle and bison industry. Why in the world would we allow unelected bureaucrats to impose a tax at that level or a fee at that level without any kind of legislative oversight at all? And that's what the Reins Act would do. Is if you're going to have that kind of an economic impact, it's not going into effect until we vote on it. And that's one thing that I think is very, very important. We also need to be a lot better at definitionally. We need to provide better definitions of what it is that we're trying to say. Use the idea of preambles. I'm also trying to delist the grizzly bear. We're also trying to stop the BLM or the Bureau of Land Management from doing some really draconian land use restrictions in Wyoming related to coal, mining, oil and gas development, rights of way, recreation. So a lot of my focus on almost everything I do is kind of regulatory related, of trying to strip power away from those agencies, return it to us, but ultimately return it to the people so that they are not subjected to a government that can destroy everything that they've built just with the snap of a finger.
So at Americans for Prosperity, we've worked on, regulatory reform for years. And just like you have thought of it as a real important part of getting the economy going in the right direction, kind of defending everyday Americans and businesses. And the problem is it's not sexy a lot of times. People don't find it as interesting. Actually, the stories that you're telling actually are really interesting and they highlight the injustice. So I applaud you for bringing those forth. And I think that we are on the cusp of some great reform there that can really unleash the economy.
I'll give you an example of the lack of accountability within an agency. I don't know if you or your listeners have heard of the Gold King mine in southwestern Colorado, but in 2015, the EPA, in the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history, other than what just happened now out in California with the fires, but the EPA went in and they blew a hole in the front of the front of the Gold King mine. They blew a hole in the structure that was holding back. There was water in there and they knew it. They released over 2.3 million gallons of just really horrible stuff. This is the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history, and it was caused by the EPA. Had that been an individual who did that, they would go to prison for life. They would have lost everything that they owned. They would have taken their shoes. They would have taken everything that they owned. But because it was an EPA employee who was doing it, who ordered that they go through that portal, nobody has ever been held accountable for that. They've never been held accountable for the entire environmental degradation that they caused throughout the entire Animas River in southwestern Colorado and New Mexico. They never even notified people who were getting their water out of that river, because that river is a source of drinking water for tens of thousands of people. This was such a terrible environmental disaster, and they never even notified anybody downstream for over 24 hours. Nobody has been held accountable for that. But if it were an individual, the person who pays the taxes to pay their salaries, they would have gone to prison over it. And that, again, is why we've created a two-tier sense of government that isn't fair and we need to fix.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's been a lot of instances where Americans' rights have been violated by their own government. Turning to the Supreme Court decision that's kind of allowed this kind of right-sizing, hopefully, the administrative state, the Loper Bright decision. I mean, as an attorney, what did you think when that decision came down?
Well, that was my law firm that did that.
Really?
Yeah, it was NCLA, the New Civil Liberties Alliance. So in 2019, I actually went to work for a public interest law firm. It was in D.C. I lived in Wyoming, and I gave up my private practice to do this, but it was solely focused on bringing constitutional challenges to administrative overreach. So I represented the owner of the Gold King mine against the EPA, trying to force them to pay for the takings for their creation, for what they did in terms of blowing out his mine. Wow. But we also were a part of that Loper Bright case. It wasn't my case. It was someone else in the law firm. But Chevron has been a target of ours. Chevron was the big white whale for a long, long time. And so when that decision came down last year, as you can imagine, there were a lot of celebrations for those of us who have been focusing on this as a constitutional challenge, that these regulations and this overregulation and the unaccountability violates our Constitution. And so I've brought a lot of different lawsuits under that rubric, where everything has to be related to a constitutional violation, but it's going after these administrative agencies. And that was a huge deal. But what people need to understand is it's not a substantive decision. It's a procedural decision. And it has to do with how statutes are interpreted. And there are quite a few different deference doctrines. There's Skidmore deference, and there's different deference doctrines. But what the point of this is it really has opened people's eyes as to why we and state legislators need to be much better at legislative practitioner activities. We need to be better at writing the dang laws so that everybody knows what they say. We shouldn't write things that are vague and ambiguous that a court can misinterpret or an agency can misinterpret. We need to be clear. We need to be crisp. We need to be forthright about what we're doing because our Constitution and due process requires it. You cannot prosecute somebody if they don't know what the law is. And that's why when you look at the lawsuits against Donald Trump, for example, why they were so constitutionally infirm was they were attempting to charge him by cobbling together all of these different laws and say, well, if you add this one in and then you put this one on top and then you bring this one in from the side, we can come up with a violation of law. No, that's not the way it works in our country. In our country, you have to have notice and an opportunity to be heard. You have to have the right to defend yourself. And that's why these deference doctrines are so bad, is you never know what an agency is going to determine, but that's a violation of due process.
So as we kind of get closer towards the end of our episode here, I wanted to ask you about the First Amendment Accountability Act that you've introduced. What would that legislation do?
Well, it would hold people accountable for violating people's First Amendment rights. And what we saw, I was on the Select Committee for Weaponization of the Federal Government, and that committee is not going to be operating during the 119th. But if you remember, Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi and Jonathan Turley, for example, really exposed how the social media companies were suppressing speech, and primarily the speech of conservatives. They were blocking speech on the origins of COVID, on vaccine efficacy, on the 2020 election. And there was this whole of government approach, an effort to try to restrict people from talking about disfavored subjects. So what we found out is that the government was going to those social media companies and threatening them and saying, you have to take this blankety blank post down and you have to blankety blank block that guy over there because he keeps saying mean things about the First Lady and blah, blah, blah. Well, all of that violates our First Amendment right of freedom of speech. But there are also opportunities where they were violating our right to peaceably assemble during the whole COVID nonsense. I mean, everybody went wacko during COVID, and you can't go to church. You can't have a rally, and you can't go to your friend's house. That's a violation of our right for peaceably to assemble. They were preventing us from worshiping the way that we choose. That's a violation of the free exercise clause. So you start looking at how our government has repeatedly violated our First Amendment rights. We can't hold anybody accountable for that. So I wrote the First Amendment Accountability Act, and I worked with Jonathan Turley, and the purpose of this was, and Dan Bishop, one of the other representatives on the Judiciary Committee. Yeah. But the purpose of this is if a federal employee violates your First Amendment right, you can personally sue them. You can get damages, you can get an injunction, and most importantly, you could get attorney's fees. And I think you were curious as to, well, give me an example of where this would apply. Do you remember right before Christmas how FEMA admitted that their employees, that their standard operating procedure was to not go to the homes of people who had Trump signs out front? Well, that's classic viewpoint discrimination. They were restricting and withholding federal funds and resources based upon the political leanings of the person in the House, regardless of whether they'd suffered damages or not. Classic violation of the First Amendment and one of the most abhorrent violations of the First Amendment. So under my bill, the people who were doing that, we could have sued them. Any one of those homeowners could have sued those people individually. And you know what that would have done? They'd have never done it again. You would not see federal employees blatantly violating freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom to peaceably assemble, freedom to petition your government for redress. I mean, heck, they're throwing people out of school board meetings. I have the right to petition my school board if I believe that they are not handling and protecting my child. I have a classic First Amendment right to do that. And again, my bill would have allowed anybody to sue over that. We're reintroducing it this session, and I'm hoping we can get this moving forward because we need to protect the constitutional rights. And part of the way that we do that is we hold people accountable for violating them.
I commend you for doing that. I think, obviously I lived through the pandemic and was horrified by the disregard for our Constitution. And we can't forget that. I think that it takes some time to go back and look and examine what happened. But and there's continued violations. But there's so many egregious violations. And I kind of felt like as a country, we kind of failed the test constitutionally in terms of what we valued or at least what our leaders really valued in terms of fidelity to the Constitution. And sure, it was a difficult time, but I think one great thing is we saw a lot of Americans stand up and say, I'm not going to take this. This is not the country that I believe I'm supposed to live in, and I don't think this is in line with the Constitution. And so I really appreciate that you're putting forth legislation and putting a focus on those violations that happened. And bottom line, our free speech is one of the most fundamental rights we have. It leads to so many others. So I really appreciate your focus on that.
I filed the very first lawsuit against COVID vaccines in the United States. I sued Michigan State University on behalf of an employee. And our argument was that she had natural immunity. Their refusal to recognize it was a violation of her rights and really contrary to science. And all of that has been borne out because it was the first lawsuit. Obviously, the courts were pretty skittish. We didn't win that one, but it provided the foundation for lawsuits that came after. And other folks did end up winning those cases. You always got to have somebody that's out there at the forefront. And we were, and I'm very proud of that work. Because what they did was wrong. And the Constitution doesn't matter when everything's easy. The Constitution matters when it's a crisis. When I'm just walking down the street, nobody really cares if I'm talking to somebody or I'm on the phone with my attorney or yelling at somebody who works for the EPA. That's exercising my First Amendment right. That's an easy one. The hard one is when I have the right to say no to somebody in a position of power that I can't go to church. I do get to go to church and you can't stop me. You could potentially stop them in Canada or England, but not in America. We got a First Amendment right. And we had too many people who were willing to say, yeah, but it's a pandemic. It's a crisis. No, that's when it matters. That's when it counts.
I couldn't agree more. I'll tell you a real fast story about religious freedom. During the pandemic, this is going to be so counter to logic, but we went to California and because we had a relative at a house and we stayed there. It was beautiful. And we actually found a family that were hosting church secretly in their home. And so we ended up staying there because we could actually go to church in these people's home. We had a park around back. You almost felt like the first century Christians doing secret church in somebody's home. And I was like, man, this isn't the way America's supposed to work.
I think we fought a war over that 250 years ago and we won. So let's not give it up now.
Yep. Well, Congresswoman, this has been an absolute joy. I'm so excited about the work you're doing on so many fronts. But wrangling the administrative state is such a giant behemoth of a job, but so worthy, and so excited for your leadership here. So we really appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you. And for all of your listeners, they can follow me at hageman.house.gov. And also, we send out a newsletter every Sunday that lays out everything I've done in the previous week, videos, hearings, what we're planning on doing coming up. It's very informative. I've got people all over the United States who are subscribers, so it's not just for people in Wyoming. Just because a lot of the stuff that we're doing is affecting others as well. And I'm very honored to represent Wyoming. I'm proud of what we've done. I'm proud of my team. I think that we're getting on the right track. And yesterday was an exciting day with the inauguration. And I'm incredibly optimistic of where we're going.
That's fabulous. What's so clear to me is, like, not only are you defending freedom as a member of Congress, but you've spent a lifetime doing that as a litigator and for so many great causes. So we greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, folks, I'm sure the Congressman would agree that liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend liberty and freedom. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.